Welcome, everyone. Before we get going, it's a fun idea if you let us know where you're listening from. Cheers. Please like and subscribe. Let's relax and start. I've always valued control. There's a certain comfort in knowing that every aspect of my life, down to the smallest detail, fits neatly into place. My work as an architect reflects that precision, every angle, every measurement, perfectly calculated. And for 8 years, I thought my marriage was the same: ordered, stable, reliable. Laura and I fit together like the blueprints of a structure I designed with careful thought. But structures have weaknesses, faults you don't see until you're already inside them. It started on a Tuesday, as mundane as any other. Laura had told me she'd be late, another one of her work dinners. That wasn't unusual. In PR, these things happened. I told her I'd wait for her, and she didn't seem to mind. But as I sat in the car outside the hotel waiting for her to finish, something gnawed at me. It wasn't anything I could define, just a sense that something was wrong. The hotel lobby was quiet. I stepped out of the car, deciding to stretch my legs and pass the time. That's when I saw her, stepping out of the elevator. She was with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, confident. The kind of man who looked like he belonged in a place like this. They were talking, too close, his hand brushing against her back. It could have been nothing, a simple gesture, but it sent a flicker of doubt through me. I didn't confront her. That would have been impulsive, and impulsiveness was not in my nature. Instead, I waited, watched them leave in separate directions. She saw me moments later, greeted me with the same smile I'd seen 1,000 times before, as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't tilted slightly off its axis. That night, I didn't sleep much. I couldn't shake the image of them together. The way she had laughed with him, the ease with which she had leaned toward him. It wasn't an affair yet, not in my mind, but something was off. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I checked her phone. No texts, nothing incriminating. She was smart, smarter than that. Still, my gut told me I hadn't imagined it. 2 days later, I returned to the hotel, not as a suspicious husband, but as a man curious about what he might find. The lobby was quiet again, and I made small talk with the manager, an older man with a welcoming smile. I mentioned Laura, describing her in passing, saying I'd seen her here recently. His face changed subtly, a flicker of recognition followed by a casual comment. "Oh, her? Stunning woman, isn't she? She usually meets clients here. High-end, very discreet." He smiled as if we were sharing a secret. I froze, the world around me slowing to a crawl. Clients? Discreet? The words twisted in my mind. "Clients?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Yeah," he said, lowering his voice. $1,000 an hour or so, I've heard. If you're interested." He handed me a card. I took it, my hand steady, though my mind was reeling. I thanked him and walked out of the hotel in a daze. Laura. My Laura, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. And yet here she was, leading a life I hadn't even glimpsed. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the card the manager had given me, my heart thudding heavily in my chest. I could have confronted her then. I could have gone home, demanded answers, thrown accusations at her, let my rage spill out in one messy burst. But that wasn't me. That wasn't how I operated. If Laura had chosen to lead this life, then I would make sure she paid for it in a way that mattered. Not in anger, not in tears, but in control, my control. I didn't want to hurt her. I wanted to dismantle her, piece by piece, until everything she'd built came crumbling down. She wouldn't even see it coming. That night, I began my plan, every detail, every move, carefully plotted like one of my architectural designs. She would lose everything. Her career, her friends, her lover, one by one. And I would make sure that when the dust settled, she'd be left with nothing, just the wreckage of her choices. Laura didn't know it by yet, but she had just become a project, a structure with cracks I would exploit until the foundation gave way entirely. It began with something small. I knew I couldn't rush, couldn't strike without careful precision. I wanted her to feel the ground shift beneath her feet, but subtly at first, like the tremors before a massive earthquake. so I started at her work. Laura thrived in her career, and I knew attacking that part of her life would hurt the most. It took me less than a week to set the first piece in motion. An anonymous email, carefully worded, sent to her boss, forwarding what appeared to be a critical error in one of her accounts. I found the weakness in her projects, something that, at a glance, looked like an oversight, but one that would sow just enough doubt in her competence. The kind of thing that wouldn't immediately cause a major issue, but would make those around her raise an eyebrow. I overheard her on the phone later that day. She was flustered, though trying to hide it, as she explained to her boss that it must have been a mistake, that it wasn't her fault. I could picture the look of confusion on her face, the dawning realization that something wasn't quite right, though she wouldn't know what. Not yet. She brushed it off when she came home. Just a weird day at work, she said with a tight smile. Some screw-up with the accounts. I'll fix it tomorrow. I nodded, sympathetic, pretending to care while secretly enjoying the first crack in her perfect life. The game had begun. Over the next few weeks, I kept the pressure light, subtle. Small disruptions here and there, nothing that would lead her to me or make her suspect that her life was unraveling by design. I'd send anonymous messages to a few of her colleagues, hinting at some vague rumor about Laura's new relationship with Ryan. I planted these whispers carefully, enough to make them gossip among themselves, never sure if it was true, but slowly adding doubt to their view of her. The conversations that followed were fascinating. I overheard one when I dropped by her office unannounced, claiming I was in the area. I stood near the reception area, watching as two of her colleagues chatted near the coffee machine. "Did you hear about Laura and Ryan?" one of them whispered. "Yeah, I heard something," the other replied, glancing nervously toward her office. "I mean, they're always meeting outside work, right?" "I don't know. She's married, isn't she?" "Yeah, but you know how these things go. People change." It took everything in me not to smile. The cracks were widening, and Laura had no idea. That night, she mentioned to me that one of her friends, Emily, had acted strangely over lunch, probing with awkward questions about her relationship with Ryan. Laura seemed baffled by it, her brows knitted in confusion as she sipped her wine at dinner. I played my part, offering the same comforting reassurances as always. "Emily's probably just jealous," I suggested, watching her carefully. "You know how people get when they see someone else being successful?" She nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She was beginning to wonder if Emily knew something. The seed was planted. Emily was the first unintended casualty. A few days later, she confronted Laura directly. I only heard about it secondhand, but I could tell the confrontation had rattled Laura deeply. It came up over dinner, her voice tense as she relayed the conversation to me. "Emily practically accused me of having an affair with Ryan," she said, her hands gripping her wine glass tightly. "I don't understand where this is coming from." I didn't let her see how much I relished the confusion, the small cracks in her armor. "You know how people are," I said softly. "Jealousy can make them say ridiculous things." She nodded but said nothing more, and I knew I had succeeded in driving a wedge between her and her closest friend. Emily's loyalty to Laura was starting to waver, and it wouldn't be long before that rift deepened. In the meantime, I escalated things further. I knew I couldn't stop with just her work or her friends. I needed her to feel pressure from all sides. The more I pushed, the more she would unravel. I found her work email easily enough. She used the same password for everything. It didn't take long for me to dig up a sensitive document or two, nothing too catastrophic, but enough to cause a minor scandal when I leaked it to a rival company. Anonymously, of course. I watched from the sidelines as her workplace descended into chaos over the next few days. Accusations flew, and Laura was caught in the middle of it all. She came home one night after a particularly grueling day, her face drawn and pale. She didn't speak much at dinner, barely touched her food, and went straight to bed without a word. I knew she was crumbling. At the same time, I was careful to keep her affair with Ryan boiling beneath the surface. I sent him anonymous threats, emails telling him that I knew about their meetings. I made sure the messages were vague, enough to unsettle him, but not to push him into action just yet. Laura and Ryan's meetings became more sporadic. When they did meet, there was tension. I knew this because I was watching, always nearby, always tracking them. They began to argue, little fights at first, but those always lead to bigger things. I could see it in the way they moved around each other, the growing irritation in their voices. Laura was under pressure at work, with her friends, and now with her lover. Everything was falling apart, just as I had planned. But there was a problem I hadn't anticipated. Emily wasn't giving up. She was still suspicious, still asking questions. I didn't expect her to dig so deeply, to start looking into things that could expose my involvement. She didn't have proof, not yet, but she was getting too close. I couldn't let that happen. I began to discredit Emily, starting with our mutual friends. Subtle hints in conversation, little remarks questioning her stability, her mental health. People believed me because I had always been calm, rational, trustworthy. Emily, on the other hand, was getting more and more frantic, her suspicions about Laura and me pushing her into emotional outbursts. It worked. Soon our friends started distancing themselves from her, thinking she was just overreacting, letting her emotions get the best of her. It isolated her, made her less of a threat. Still, there was an undeniable thrill in seeing Laura unravel. She was trapped, boxed in by forces she couldn't understand, and every day brought her closer to the edge. She wasn't yet aware that her lover, her friends, and her career were all slipping away, each of them carefully manipulated into position by me. But the time for her to realize that truth was coming. She came to me one night, desperate, clinging to the only thing she thought she could still control, us. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything's falling apart, and I feel like I'm losing everything." I wrapped my arms around her, my expression a mask of concern. "You're not losing me," I said, my voice soft and reassuring. "I'll always be here." It was the ultimate irony. She was falling apart, and I was the only one she thought she could rely on. But even as she leaned on me, I knew I was the one pulling the strings, the architect of her collapse. And yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, how long before she realized the truth? Precision and control. Those two words echoed in my mind as I sat at my desk, staring at Laura's inbox on my laptop. I had been cautious up until this point, but now it was time to escalate. The small disruptions I'd set in motion were working. She was rattled, but still holding on. It wasn't enough. If I was going to destroy her, I had to dismantle everything. Her professional life, her personal life, her reputation, nothing could be left standing. The emails were easy to access. Laura never changed her passwords. Predictable. I found a series of confidential documents that could easily be leaked, and I smiled as I imagined the chaos they would create. There was a project she had been working on for months, something critical for her company's financial success. I drafted an anonymous email to a competitor, attaching a few key files that would suggest Laura's involvement in corporate espionage. It wasn't the truth, of course, but the beauty of it was that it didn't need to be. The doubt alone would be enough to tear everything apart. With one click, it was done. I leaned back, feeling the satisfaction of a meticulously crafted move. Now I just had to watch it unfold. The fallout came quicker than I expected. Less than a week after the email was sent, Laura's office was in turmoil. I could see the stress weighing on her when she came home, the way she barely spoke, her eyes clouded with exhaustion and confusion. She mentioned nothing specific, just vague comments about issues at work and something off with a project. I listened, as always, offering her my support, knowing full well that the storm had only just begun. It didn't take long for accusations to surface. Anonymous tips were flooding into her company, suggesting Laura's involvement in leaking information. Her superiors were skeptical at first. Laura had always been a top performer. But the evidence I'd planted was enough to push them into an internal investigation. The pressure was mounting. At home, she started to unravel. She'd become short-tempered, snapping at me for the smallest things, and I welcomed it. The more she broke, the closer I got to my goal. I don't know what's going on anymore, she said one night, her voice thin and strained. Everything is falling apart at work. They think I leaked the project files. I feigned shock. That's ridiculous. You'd never do something like that. Don't they trust you? They did, she replied, rubbing her forehead. But someone's out to get me. I just don't know who. I stayed silent, savoring the irony. She was right. Someone was out to get her, but she would never suspect it was me. As the situation at her job spiraled, I moved on to the next phase. Ryan. I needed their relationship to crack, to crumble, just like her career. They were still seeing each other, though less frequently now, thanks to the pressure I had applied with the anonymous threats. But their affair hadn't ended yet, and that had to change. I started sending Ryan direct messages, this time more specific. I used a burner phone, sending texts that made it clear someone was watching them. The messages were carefully crafted, enough to scare him, but not enough to push him to Laura. I wanted him to doubt her, to think that she had been careless, that her reckless behavior had put them both in jeopardy. The effect was immediate. Their meetings became tense. I knew this because I was always there watching them from a distance, studying their body language. Ryan was growing agitated, and Laura, already stressed from her work situation, was too distracted to notice that the man she had betrayed me for was starting to pull away. Their affair had been a fire once, burning with excitement and danger, but now it was smoldering, suffocating under the weight of their problems. They argued often, their once secret rendezvous devolving into shouting matches. Laura would come home afterward, her eyes red, her mood darker than ever. She never told me about the fights. She still believed in the facade, that I was her safe harbor in the middle of a storm, and I let her believe that, all the while fueling the fire that would consume her. Then came the unforeseen consequence. Emily. I hadn't anticipated her loyalty to Laura or her determination to figure out what was happening. She was beginning to suspect that something wasn't right, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she started poking around in places that could lead her too close to me. One afternoon, I saw them at a cafe, sitting by the window. Laura looked distraught, her hands fidgeting nervously on the table. Emily, on the other hand, appeared calm, but her eyes betrayed her concern. She was asking questions, pressing Laura for details, trying to connect the dots that didn't quite make sense. Laura, of course, didn't have the answers. How could she? She was the victim of a game she didn't even know was being played. I couldn't allow Emily to interfere. She was a loose thread that needed to be cut. I began subtly discrediting her within our social circle. It wasn't hard. Emily had always been the more emotional one, prone to dramatic outbursts and passionate convictions. I started small, planting doubts in casual conversations with mutual friends. Emily's been acting strange lately, hasn't she? I said during one dinner party, just loud enough for the right people to hear. I think she's stressed about something. She seems a little unstable. The seed was planted, and soon enough, others began to notice. Emily's concern for Laura became something more, a perceived obsession, a sign that she was losing touch with reality. I could see the frustration in her eyes when people began distancing themselves, chalking up her concerns to paranoia. She was becoming isolated, just as I had intended. But I couldn't relax. Emily hadn't given up. She confronted me one evening out of the blue. After a social gathering, her face was tight with anger, her eyes searching mine for something. An admission, a crack in my facade. She didn't have proof, but she knew something was wrong. Nathan, I don't know what you're doing, but I know you're involved in this, she hissed, keeping her voice low. I kept my expression calm, passive. Involved in what, Emily? Laura's been under a lot of stress lately. We all have. Her fists clenched, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But instead, she took a step back, shaking her head. You're not fooling me. I'll figure it out. I smiled, a cold, controlled smile. I hope you do. But be careful, Emily. You wouldn't want people thinking you've lost your mind. She turned on her heel and left without another word. I watched her go, knowing that she wouldn't stop digging. But it didn't matter. I had already undermined her credibility. By the time she figured anything out, no one would believe her. Meanwhile, Laura was slipping further into chaos. Her career was in shambles. Her affair with Ryan was disintegrating, and her friends, thanks to me, were starting to question her judgment. She was unraveling at a pace that surprised even me. The control I had over the situation was intoxicating, but I also realized that things were beginning to spiral in ways I hadn't anticipated. One of Laura's colleagues, a woman named Melissa, had apparently been digging into the internal investigation at work. She had always been ambitious, eager to move up the corporate ladder, and it seemed that Laura's downfall presented her with an opportunity. Melissa had uncovered some of the falsified evidence I had planted, but she wasn't convinced that Laura was behind it. She had started asking questions, poking around in the IT department, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she found a digital trail that could lead back to me. I needed to act fast. The tension between Laura and Ryan reached its breaking point soon after. I had continued to send him anonymous messages, and eventually, the paranoia became too much for him. One evening, after another one of their explosive fights, he sent her a curt text. "This isn't worth it, we're done." Laura broke down that night. I found her sitting in the dark in the living room, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She didn't look up when I walked in, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel a flicker of something, pity perhaps. But it was quickly extinguished by the satisfaction of knowing that my plan was nearly complete. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've lost everything. My job, Ryan, my friends. I don't know what's happening." I crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, the perfect picture of a concerned husband. "You haven't lost me," I said softly. "We'll get through this." She leaned into me, her sobs racking her body, and I held her, knowing that I had orchestrated every bit of her despair. But as I sat there, comforting the woman I was systematically destroying, I couldn't shake the growing sense that things were beginning to slip beyond my control. Melissa's investigation, Emily's persistence, the escalating tension in every part of Laura's life, it was all moving faster than I had planned. The chaos I had created was no longer just Laura's problem. It was becoming mine too. Emily had become a problem. I hadn't anticipated the depth of her loyalty to Laura. Despite the distance I had created between them, Emily persisted, constantly checking in on Laura, probing, and digging for the truth. She had no proof, of course, but her instincts were sharp, and if she kept looking, she might uncover something I didn't want her to. I had done everything I could to undermine her credibility with our mutual friends, but that wasn't enough. She still had influence over Laura, and that was dangerous. One evening, after another one of her meddlesome visits, Laura seemed different. She was quieter, more reflective than usual, her eyes distant. Emily must have planted some new suspicion in her mind. As we sat in the living room, Laura turned to me suddenly, her voice soft. "Nathan, do you think something's wrong with me?" The question startled me. I had expected Emily's influence to rattle Laura, but not like this. I kept my face neutral, careful not to reveal anything. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "Emily keeps asking me these questions. She's worried about me, about how everything's been falling apart. She thinks I'm being sabotaged." For a moment, I felt a chill. Emily was getting too close. "Sabotaged?" I laughed, trying to brush it off. "That's ridiculous. You've had a run of bad luck, but there's no conspiracy against you." Laura stared at me, her eyes searching my face. She thinks maybe someone's trying to ruin me." My pulse quickened, but I maintained my composure. "Who would do something like that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked away, her brows furrowed in thought. I could feel her doubt creeping in. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. Laura was starting to question everything. It was subtle, but the seed had been planted, and I knew it would grow. Emily needed to be neutralized, and I had to act quickly. But she was more determined than I had expected. She confronted me again, this time with more force. We crossed paths outside Laura's office after a tense lunch between the two of them. Emily's eyes were sharp, her body rigid with determination. "I don't know what game you're playing, Nathan," she hissed, keeping her voice low, "but I'm going to figure it out. Laura deserves to know the truth." I met her gaze unflinching. I'm not playing any games, Emily. Maybe you should stop filling her head with paranoid ideas. She's already under enough stress. She's stressed because of you, she shot back. You're the one pulling the strings here. I don't know how, but I know you are. The accusation hung between us. She was right, of course, but she had no way of proving it. Still, her persistence was dangerous. I couldn't let her keep pushing. If she got too close to the truth, everything I'd worked for would unravel. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to match hers. Be careful, Emily. You're making some serious accusations. You wouldn't want people to think you're losing it. Her eyes flared with anger, but I saw something else in them too. Hesitation. I had already sown enough doubt about her mental stability among our friends, and I knew that doubt was starting to affect her, whether she wanted to admit it or not. She turned away without another word, but I knew this wasn't over. Emily wouldn't back down easily, and that meant I had to accelerate my plan. While Emily continued to stir suspicion, I turned my focus back to Laura. Her relationship with Ryan was hanging by a thread, but I needed to push it over the edge. I started sending him more anonymous messages, making them more threatening this time. I wanted him to feel like he was in danger, like his involvement with Laura was about to blow up in his face. It worked. Ryan's responses to Laura became colder, more distant. They fought more frequently, their once passionate affair now reduced to bitter arguments and resentment. He accused her of being reckless, of not being careful enough, and she, in turn, became defensive, insisting she had done everything to protect their secret. But the cracks were too deep now. Ryan wasn't interested in keeping up the charade anymore. He had his own reputation to perruffing, and he wasn't going to let Laura's chaotic life drag him down with her. After one particularly heated argument, he cut her off completely. I watched it happen from a distance, the way he stormed out of the cafe where they had been meeting, leaving her standing there, stunned. It was the moment I had been waiting for. That night, Laura came home broken. She barely spoke, retreating to the bedroom without eating dinner. I gave her space, letting her wallow in her misery, knowing that I was the one who had orchestrated it all. She didn't know it yet, but she was standing at the edge of a cliff, and I was about to give her the final push. While Laura's world continued to crumble, I had another problem: Melissa. She was a colleague of Laura's, and she had taken a particular interest in the investigation at work. It seemed that the false evidence I had planted was starting to unravel, and Melissa was determined to find out who was behind it. I hadn't expected someone like her to get involved, but now that she was, I needed to deal with it. Melissa wasn't like Emily. She didn't operate on suspicion and loyalty. She was driven by ambition, and if she uncovered the truth, it would be for her own gain. That made her even more dangerous. I started by gathering information. Melissa was meticulous, but everyone had weaknesses, and I was good at finding them. It didn't take long to discover that she had her own secrets, an affair with a married executive at the company. It wasn't widely known, but I had my ways of uncovering things people wanted to keep hidden. I decided to use that against her. I sent an anonymous tip to her boss, carefully worded to suggest that Melissa's investigation was a cover for her own misconduct. It wasn't enough to destroy her outright, but it was enough to cast doubt on her motivations. The internal investigation shifted focus, and soon, Melissa was forced to defend herself instead of digging deeper into Laura's case. With Melissa out of the way, I turned my full attention back to Laura. She was unraveling faster than I had expected. Her career was in jeopardy, her affair had collapsed, and her friends were distancing themselves one by one. She leaned on me more than ever, desperate for support, unaware that I was the architect of her downfall. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Laura had been called into a meeting with her superiors at work, and I knew what was coming. The investigation into the leaked documents had reached a dead end, but the damage to her reputation was already done. She had become a liability, and in the world of corporate PR, there was no room for liabilities. When she came home that night, she looked like a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't say a word as she walked past me and headed straight for the bedroom. I followed her, waiting for her to speak, to tell me what had happened. But when I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, I knew I didn't need to hear the details. "They fired me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I sat beside her, playing the role of the supportive husband. "I'm so sorry, Laura. I can't believe they would do this to you." She didn't respond. Her hands were trembling, and I could see the weight of everything crashing down on her. This was the moment I had been working toward for months, but now that it was here, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just emptiness. Laura was broken. Her life had been dismantled piece by piece, and she had no idea that I was the one behind it all. She had lost everything, her career, her lover, her friends. All that remained was me, the man she thought she could rely on. But as I sat there watching her unravel, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. I had done everything perfectly, calculated every move with precision. And yet the consequences were beginning to spiral out of control. Melissa was still out there, and while I had managed to delay her investigation, I knew it wasn't over. Emily, too, was still a threat. She hadn't given up, and the more she dug, the more likely she was to find something that could expose me. And then there was Laura. She was clinging to me now, but how long before she started to question everything? How long before she realized that the one person she trusted was the very person who had orchestrated her destruction? For the first time since I had started this, I felt a crack in my own armor. I had been so focused on dismantling Laura's life that I hadn't considered the consequences for myself. The chaos I had unleashed was no longer just hers to bear, it was mine too. Laura's desperation grew in the days that followed. She tried to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, but there was nothing left for her to hold on to. Every attempt to rebuild was met with failure, and I knew she was nearing the point of collapse. But so was I. The control I had prided myself on was slipping away. I had set so many things in motion, but now they were moving too fast for me to manage. Emily's suspicion, Melissa's investigation, Laura's unraveling, it was all converging, and I could feel the noose tightening around my neck. I had wanted revenge. I had wanted to destroy Laura for betraying me, and I had succeeded. But in doing so, I had set fire to everything, and now I was standing in the middle of the flames. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep control. The final blow had to be flawless. It wasn't enough that I dismantled Laura's career, that her personal life had been reduced to rubble, or that her affair with Ryan had collapsed into dust. I needed something permanent, something she could never recover from. The pieces were already in place, the whispered rumors, the anonymous tips, but it was time for the grand finale. And this time, I wasn't aiming just for her reputation. I wanted to ensure she was entirely stripped of everything. I had been collecting the footage for months. Laura and Ryan had been reckless in their meetings, especially in the beginning, when the thrill of their affair blinded them to the risks. A grainy camera in a parking garage, a hidden recorder in Ryan's office, small, incremental captures that, when stitched together, painted a damning picture. It was the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Their hands on each other, their whispered conversations, the way they thought no one was watching. But I was, always. The hard drive in front of me contained hours of footage, but I only needed a few minutes to deliver the final blow. I carefully edited the footage, selecting the most incriminating moments. Ryan kissing her in the shadows of a stairwell, her laughing about their meetings with careless arrogance, the two of them together in his office late at night. It was all there, condensed into a damning 2-minute video that would destroy her in an instant. But I wasn't done. I had to be meticulous in my delivery. I created a new anonymous email account, one that couldn't be traced back to me. I attached the video along with a short message. Your employee, Laura Crowley, has been engaging in an affair with a business partner. This footage was taken on company property. I thought you should know. With the email addressed to her boss and a few key figures in her company's HR department, I hit send. There was no going back now. The video would spread like wildfire through the office, and within hours, Laura's career would be over for good. But I wasn't stopping there. I sent the same video to a few of her closest friends using another anonymous account. I had been careful, ensuring the email chain couldn't be linked to me. By the time she realized what was happening, her world would be in freefall. I sat back in my chair, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction wash over me. I had done it. Laura's life was about to implode, and I was the architect of her downfall. There was no part of her world left intact. No career, no lover, no friends. And the best part was, she still had no idea I was behind it all. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout to begin. Laura's phone started buzzing incessantly the next morning. She was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee, oblivious to what was coming. I watched her frown as she checked her messages, her face growing pale with each new notification. Her hand trembled as she read through the texts, and I knew the video had hit. She dropped her phone onto the counter, her eyes wide with disbelief, and then ran to the bedroom to grab her laptop. I followed her slowly, watching her log into her work email, frantically scrolling through the flood of messages from her coworkers and superiors. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no." I stood in the doorway silent as she started to hyperventilate. Tears welled up in her eyes as the realization hit her. The video was out, and there was no way to take it back. She was done. She didn't notice me standing there, didn't realize I had been watching her unravel. All I felt was a strange numbness, the satisfaction I had expected never fully materializing. I thought seeing her like this would bring me closure, but instead, it felt hollow. Like I had just cut the final cord, and now there was nothing left. Her world collapsed within hours. Her boss called her into a meeting that same day, and I knew exactly how it would go. They would play the video for her, cold and clinical, and she would be forced to sit there and watch the destruction of her own career. By the time she returned home, her eyes were red and swollen, and I could see the weight of her humiliation dragging her down. "I've been fired," she said, her voice hoarse. She sat down on the couch, staring at nothing. They showed me the video." I pretended to be shocked, shaking my head. "I can't believe they would do this to you. There has to be something we can do." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, it's over. Everyone knows." She curled into herself, her sobs racking her body, and I sat beside her, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. It was almost surreal how deeply she was unraveling right in front of me. I had wanted to see her break, and here she was, shattered into 1,000 pieces. But I felt none of the victory I had expected, only the creeping realization that maybe I had gone too far. But even as Laura's life crumbled, mine started to unravel too. It began with a single email. One of Laura's former colleagues, someone who had been investigating the leak at her company, had reached out to HR. Apparently, they had been digging into the origins of the anonymous emails and had discovered something unsettling, traces of metadata that pointed to the possibility of tampering. Melissa had resurfaced, it seemed. Her ambition had driven her to investigate further than I had anticipated. I had thought I'd neutralized her, but she had kept looking. And now, she had found something. The email hinted at an internal review being launched, and I knew that if they dug deep enough, they might trace the sabotage back to me. My carefully orchestrated revenge was spiraling out of control, and I was no longer the one holding the reins. Panic began to set in. I had been so focused on dismantling Laura's life that I hadn't considered the possibility of my own exposure. If they linked the emails to me, if they found out that I had been the one manipulating everything from the start, it wouldn't just be Laura's life that was destroyed. It would be mine too. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. There had to be a way out. I had been careful, hadn't I? I had covered my tracks, used multiple anonymous accounts, encrypted the emails. But the doubt gnawed at me. Had I overlooked something? Was there a trail that I hadn't anticipated? I started deleting files, wiping the hard drives that contained any trace of my sabotage. But the panic lingered. What if it wasn't enough? As I scrambled to cover my tracks, Ryan made his move. I hadn't anticipated that he would retaliate, but it seemed he had been preparing his own response. He wasn't just some careless lover. He had connections, resources, and now he was using them against me. I received a legal notice in the mail a few days later. Ryan was accusing me of defamation, claiming that I had been behind the threats and leaks that had led to his public humiliation. He had hired a team of digital forensics experts to investigate the source of the anonymous emails, and they were getting closer to tracing it all back to me. My carefully constructed plan was crumbling before my eyes. What had started as a calculated, meticulous revenge was spiraling into a nightmare. Ryan was determined to take me down, and the evidence was mounting against me. If I didn't act quickly, everything I had built, my career, my reputation, would be destroyed. I spent nights sleepless, combing through every detail, every step I had taken. But it was no use. The walls were closing in, and I was running out of options. Laura, oblivious to my panic, was barely functioning. She had become a shell of herself, too consumed by her own ruin to notice the cracks in my composure. She spent her days in bed, avoiding calls from the few friends who hadn't yet abandoned her. Her once vibrant personality had been drained away, leaving behind only the remnants of a woman who had lost everything. I should have felt triumphant. I had achieved exactly what I had set out to do. Laura was ruined, but instead I felt trapped in the very chaos I had created. The consequences of my actions were spiraling out of my control, and I was powerless to stop them. Every step I had taken had been calculated, precise, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly things would spiral. I had believed I could control everything: Laura, Ryan, the people around us. But now, as the consequences of my revenge began to close in on me, I realized just how wrong I had been. The satisfaction I had expected never came. All I felt was dread, knowing that the spiral I had created was about to consume me too. After the video was sent, I waited, knowing that this would be the moment that cemented everything. The house was silent, the kind of oppressive quiet that hung in the air, wrapping itself around me like a fog. Laura hadn't come out of the bedroom all morning. I imagined her lying there, her life in ruins, too exhausted and broken to do anything but retreat deeper into her misery. But even as I anticipated the satisfaction of my final act, I felt something else growing inside me, a gnawing, uneasy sense of paranoia. The chaos I'd unleashed was no longer contained. There were too many variables now, too many things spiraling out of control. Melissa's investigation into the leak had resurfaced, and Ryan was pressing forward with his own legal case against me. Each step I'd taken had been precise, deliberate, but now I couldn't be sure if I'd covered my tracks well enough. The weight of my actions was pressing down on me, harder than I had ever anticipated. I needed to think, to regain control, but every time I tried to focus, the thought of Ryan's forensics team unraveling my sabotage crept back into my mind. It was only a matter of time before they linked the anonymous threats and leaked files back to me. And once they did, everything I had worked for, my career, my reputation, would collapse just like Laura's. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing in the living room as I considered my options. There was no undoing what had been done, no erasing the digital footprints that might lead them to me. But perhaps there was a way to mitigate the damage, to shift the blame. My mind raced through possibilities. I needed someone to take the fall, someone whose credibility had already been damaged, whose behavior had been erratic enough to raise doubts. Emily. She had already been teetering on the edge. Her obsession with uncovering the truth about Laura's downfall, isolating her from everyone else. If I could make it look like she had been behind the sabotage, then maybe, just maybe, I could throw them off my trail long enough to cover the rest of my tracks. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best option I had. I spent the rest of the day setting up the framework. I crafted a series of emails, mimicking the tone of the anonymous messages I had sent to Laura and Ryan. But this time, I made sure they appeared to come from Emily. It wasn't hard to make her seem unstable. She had already alienated so many of her friends with her increasingly erratic behavior. Planting seeds of doubt about her involvement would be easy. I fabricated a trail of correspondence, creating the illusion that Emily had been obsessed with exposing Laura's affair and had taken drastic measures to do so. By the time I was finished, it would look like she had been the one orchestrating the sabotage all along. It was a gamble, but I didn't have a choice. The walls were closing in, and I needed a way out. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Laura was still reeling from the fallout of the video. She barely spoke to me, her face pale and drawn, as if the weight of her own ruin had physically diminished her. She spent her days locked in the bedroom, avoiding calls and emails from the few people who hadn't yet cut her off completely. I watched her from a distance, my emotions a tangled mess of triumph and dread. This was what I had wanted, what I had planned for. And yet, the satisfaction I had expected never came. Every time I saw her broken expression, I felt a creeping unease. I had won, but at what cost? And then, Ryan's retaliation hit. I received a call from my lawyer early one morning. His tone was grave, and I could feel my stomach drop as he explained the situation. Ryan's team had filed a defamation lawsuit, and they had evidence. Real evidence. They had traced the anonymous threats back to an IP address that led directly to me. "It's bad, Nathan," my lawyer said, his voice tight with concern. "If they push this, it's going to be difficult to defend. We're talking about potential criminal charges." I barely heard him. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how I had been so careless. How had they found me? I'd been so meticulous, so careful. But it didn't matter. They had me. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my head in my hands. The spiral I had set in motion was consuming me, and there was no stopping it now. Desperation took hold. In the days that followed, I tried everything I could to deflect the blame. I sent the fabricated emails implicating Emily, hoping to throw enough suspicion on her to buy myself time. I contacted my lawyer, trying to come up with some kind of defense, but nothing seemed to be enough. Ryan wasn't backing down. He had the resources, the connections, and the determination to take me down, and I was running out of options. And through it all, Laura remained in the background, a ghost of the woman she had once been. She didn't know about the lawsuit, didn't realize that I was the one behind her destruction. She was too consumed by her own misery to see the cracks forming in my carefully constructed facade. But Emily hadn't given up. She confronted me again, this time at my office. She had found the emails I had fabricated, and though she didn't have proof yet, I could see the determination in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, and she was getting closer to the truth. "You did this," she hissed, her voice low and furious. "You destroyed her. I know it." I kept my composure, refusing to show the panic that was building inside me. "Emily, you're not making any sense. You've been spiraling for months now. Maybe you should take a step back, get some help." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare patronize me. I'm going to expose you, Nathan. I don't care what it takes." I watched her leave, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were closing in faster than I had anticipated. The blame I had tried to shift onto Emily wasn't working, and Ryan's lawsuit was gaining traction. I was trapped in the very spiral I had created, and there was no way out. The paranoia set in. Every sound, every shadow felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. My thoughts raced in endless loops, trying to find a way to regain control, but it was too late. I had gone too far. Laura was broken, Ryan was coming for me, and Emily was determined to expose the truth. And as I stood in the middle of the wreckage, I realized that I had lost everything in my pursuit of revenge. The life I had so carefully built, the control, the precision, the order, was gone, consumed by the chaos I had unleashed. And I had no one to blame but myself. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard Laura's soft footsteps in the hallway. She hadn't spoken to me in days, and I wondered if this was it, if she had finally figured it out, if she was coming to confront me, but she didn't. Instead, I heard the front door open and close quietly. I sat up, listening as her car started and pulled away. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of fear. Laura had been so broken, so defeated, that I hadn't considered she might do something drastic. But now, as I stared at the empty spot where her car had been, I realized that I had pushed her too far. She was gone. I waited, hoping she would come back. But as the hours passed and the silence in the house grew heavier, I knew she wouldn't. Laura had escaped. And now I was left alone with the ruins of the life I had destroyed. There was no victory in this, no satisfaction, only the bitter realization that I had lost control long ago, and there was nothing left for me but the wreckage I had created. I had won, but in the end, I had destroyed myself too. It's strange how quiet the house feels now. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, sounds I never paid attention to before, are deafening in the silence. Laura's absence is palpable, though I had once craved this emptiness. I used to imagine how peaceful it would be when I finally dismantled her life, tore apart the web of deceit she had spun around me. But now, sitting here alone, I can't help but feel the weight of the destruction I've caused, not just hers, mine too. Her car didn't return that night, or the night after. I never called. Maybe I wanted her gone. Maybe I needed her gone. Her destruction had been my masterpiece, the culmination of months of careful planning. And yet, instead of victory, I am left with this crushing sense of finality. The end has come, and with it, an emptiness I hadn't anticipated. Ryan's case against me is still moving forward. I can feel the legal noose tightening. Every time my phone buzzes, my stomach twists in knots, expecting the next piece of bad news. My lawyer is doing everything he can to delay the inevitable, but I know it's only a matter of time before they find the evidence they need to link the sabotage back to me. It's ironic, really. I had planned every detail so meticulously, yet it's all slipping away. I walk through the house now, aimlessly. Each room feels like a relic of the life I once had, the life I destroyed. The couch where Laura would sit and pretend to work, the dining table where we shared countless meals, the bedroom where our relationship quietly disintegrated without either of us acknowledging it. Everywhere I turn, I see remnants of what we were, what I've lost. But it isn't Laura I miss. It's the sense of control, the ability to command my environment, to shape the world around me. That's what I've truly lost. Emily hasn't stopped pushing. Her persistence is almost admirable, though it's become a thorn in my side. She's convinced I'm the one responsible for Laura's downfall, and her accusations are gaining traction. The more she speaks, the more people start to question everything that's happened. The subtle rumors I'd planted about her mental stability no longer seem to be enough. People are listening to her now, and that terrifies me. The paranoia has become suffocating. I can't trust anyone anymore. Every glance, every whispered conversation feels like a threat. Even my friends, those few who haven't distanced themselves, seem to be watching me too closely. Their eyes full of questions they're too polite to ask. I can't tell if it's my own guilt playing tricks on me or if they really are starting to suspect the truth. I retreat further into myself, isolating from the world. I no longer visit the office, my architectural projects gathering dust on my desk. My career, once a source of pride, now feels meaningless. What does it matter if I'm successful, if I'm always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day everything collapses? And yet, I can't shake the lingering question, was it worth it? I thought revenge would bring me closure, that watching Laura's life disintegrate would somehow heal the wound her betrayal had carved into me. But now, standing in the wreckage of it all, I'm left wondering if I've only made the wound deeper. Laura is gone. Her life, her career, her affair with Ryan, everything is in ruins. But I haven't won. I've only torn apart my own life in the process. The final bitter irony is that while Laura was unfaithful, I am the one who destroyed everything. In my obsession with revenge, I became the villain. I see that now, though it's too late to change course. The legal case looms over me like a dark cloud. I'm losing sleep, haunted by the thought of losing everything. It's no longer just a game of manipulation and power. The consequences are real, and they're closing in fast. I used to think I could outmaneuver anyone, but now, as Ryan's lawyers dig deeper and Emily refuses to back down, I realize I'm not in control anymore. The spiral I set in motion has consumed me, just as it did Laura. I sit at the kitchen table, staring at my reflection in the glass of the sliding door. The man looking back at me is a stranger, hollow-eyed, exhausted, defeated. I've spent so long calculating every move, every twist and turn, that I didn't notice how much I was losing along the way. I sacrificed everything, my marriage, my career, my friendships, all for a revenge that now feels empty. Laura's destruction is complete, but so is mine. The phone rings again. It's my lawyer, probably with more bad news. I don't answer. Instead, I let it ring out, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I close my eyes, trying to block out the thoughts racing through my mind, but it's no use. The spiral has already consumed me, and there's no escaping it now. In the end, the control I sought so desperately was always an illusion. I thought I could manipulate the world around me, bend it to my will, but the truth is I was never in control. Not really. The chaos I unleashed took on a life of its own, and now, as I sit here alone in the silence, I'm left to wonder whether regaining control was ever truly possible. I've won, but I've also lost. And now all that's left is the aftermath, the slow, inevitable collapse of everything I once held dear. I wonder if this is how it ends for everyone who seeks revenge, or if I'm just the exception. Either way, I know one thing for certain. The spiral I created will never truly let me go. It's too late for regret, too late for redemption.